Growing up, our home felt like a military camp. My father, a college teacher, ran our lives with strict rules and high expectations. My older sister Sophia was the ideal child in his eyes, obedient, focused on her studies, and always trying to keep everyone pleased. I was the opposite, always testing the boundaries. During dinner, my father would snap, "Grace, sit up straight. A lady doesn't slouch." I'd roll my eyes, sit up briefly, then slouch again as soon as he looked away. It was a constant battle of wills between us. My mother didn't say much, but her quiet disapproval was just as strong. She'd raise an eyebrow at my clothes or the friends I chose, often sighing, "What will the neighbors think?" Despite feeling trapped at home, I tried to carve out a little freedom. When I was 15, I started dating Michael. He was 18 in college and everything my parents wouldn't want for me. We kept it a secret, meeting whenever we could. It felt like my own little escape, a slice of freedom in an otherwise controlled life. I had big dreams, to go to college, get out of my parents' tight grip, and start a life on my terms. But things didn't go as planned. A few months after my 17th birthday, I started feeling queasy every morning. At first, I brushed it off as stress from upcoming exams. But the sickness didn't go away. One day, I found myself in a gas station bathroom, staring at a pregnancy test with shaking hands. As one pink line appeared, my heart sank. Positive. I was pregnant. The next few days were a haze. My mind was racing, unable to think about anything else. I knew I had to tell Michael, but every time I tried to dial his number, I lost the courage. Eventually, I couldn't avoid it any longer. We met at our usual spot, a quiet park where no one would see us. When he saw me, he smiled, but his expression changed as soon as he noticed my face. "What's wrong?" he asked, reaching for my hand. I pulled away, wrapping my arms around myself, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm pregnant," I blurted out. The silence that followed was suffocating. Michael's face went through a series of emotions: shock, disbelief, and finally, fear. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, tears welling up. I took 6 tests, all positive. Michael ran his hand through his hair, avoiding my gaze. Finally, he muttered, "You need to get rid of it, Grace. An abortion is the only option. We're too young. It'll ruin everything." I was stunned. This was the boy I thought I loved, dismissing our baby as if it were nothing. "Get out of my sight," I said, barely containing my anger. He left without another word, leaving me alone to face the hardest decision of my life. Telling my parents was even more terrifying. I waited until after dinner. My father was in the living room, reading the newspaper, while my mother was knitting. Sophia stood nearby, her face curious but cautious. "I have something to tell you," I began, my voice trembling. My father lowered the paper, suspicion already in his eyes. "What is it, Grace?" he asked. Taking a deep breath, I said, "I'm pregnant." The room exploded. My father's face turned bright red as he started yelling about shame and disappointment. My mother burst into tears, murmuring about what the neighbors would say. Sophia stood silently, her expression a mix of shock and disappointment. "You'll get an abortion," my father said firmly after he'd calmed down enough to speak clearly. "We'll find a discreet clinic, and no one will ever have to know about this mistake." At first, I resisted. I didn't want to go through with it, but the pressure was unbearable. A few days later, I found myself in a doctor's office, with my mother and Sophia beside me, their faces blank but tense. The doctor, a kind woman in her 48s, looked over my chart with a frown, then turned to me, her eyes filled with concern. "Grace," she said gently, "I need to tell you something important. Given your medical history, if you choose to have an abortion, there's a high chance you might not be able to have children again." Her words hit me like a wave. The idea of never being able to have children again stopped me cold. I took a deep breath, my voice steadier than I expected, and said, "I'm not doing it. I'm keeping the baby." My mother gasped in shock, and Sophia rolled her eyes, but I stood firm. The drive home was tense, filled with silence, so heavy it felt like a weight pressing on me. When we arrived, My father was waiting, looking eager for news. "Well," he demanded, his eyes fixed on me. "She wouldn't do it." My mother spat, her voice full of frustration. "After everything we've done for her." My father's face contorted with anger as he took a deep breath and then spoke, his voice cold and final. "Get out. Pack your things and leave this house. You're no daughter of mine. I won't have you embarrassing this family with your condition." My mother nodded in agreement, her eyes hard and unyielding. "You heard your father. Go." Sophia just stood there, silent and judgmental. Tears streamed down my face as I rushed to my room, grabbing whatever clothes I could fit into a bag. As I headed for the door, my father's voice rang out one last time, a harsh reminder of his decision. "And don't think about coming back. As far as we're concerned, you're dead to us." The door slammed shut behind me with a sound that felt devastatingly final. Alone, pregnant, and now homeless, I had no one else to turn to. In desperation, I called the only person I thought might help, my Aunt Harper. She and my Uncle Thomas had always been the family outsiders, living in another state and rarely in touch with my parents. "Grace, what's wrong, sweeties?" Aunt Harper's warm, familiar voice was comforting. Through my tears, I explained everything. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Finally," she asked, "where are you now?" "I'm outside our house," I said, my voice shaky. "They kicked me out." Another brief silence. Then she said firmly, "Stay right there. We're coming to get you." The drive to Aunt Harper and Uncle Thomas's house was long, giving me time to process everything that had happened. When we arrived, their small, cozy home felt like a safe haven. Aunt Harper fussed over me, making sure I had something to eat, while Uncle Thomas carried my bag to a spare room that would now be mine. "It's not much," he said, setting the bag down, "but it's yours for as long as you need it." Looking around the small, warm room, I felt a lump in my throat. "It's perfect," I whispered. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of doctor's appointments, talks about my future, and adjusting to my new life. One evening at dinner, Aunt Harper spoke up. "We've been thinking," she began, "and we want to help you continue your education." I looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" Uncle Thomas leaned forward, his face kind. "We've saved some money over the years. Since we never had kids, we'd like to help you go to college." I was stunned. After everything that had happened, college seemed like an impossible dream. "I don't know what to say," I stammered. "Say yes," Aunt Harper smiled. "We believe in you, Grace. This baby doesn't have to mean the end of your dreams." With their encouragement, I enrolled in a local community college, choosing to major in business management. Balancing classes, doctor's appointments, and the challenges of pregnancy was tough, but I was determined. I also found a job as a waitress at a local restaurant. The owner, Evelyn, was a kind woman who understood my situation and gave me flexible hours. It wasn't much, but it allowed me to save for the baby and contribute to Aunt Harper and Uncle Thomas's household. The day my son was born was the most beautiful and terrifying experience of my life. After hours of labor, I held him in my arms, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes. Aunt Harper and Uncle Thomas stood nearby, beaming like proud grandparents. "What are you going to name him?" Aunt Harper asked softly. I looked down at my son, sleeping peacefully. "David," I said. "It means God is my judge, because no matter what anyone else thinks, I know I made the right choice." As I settled into motherhood, juggling a newborn, college classes, and work, my thoughts would occasionally drift to my parents and Sophia. Did they know about David? Did they regret what they had done? But I pushed those thoughts aside. I had a new family now, one that loved me unconditionally and accepted me for who I was. One day, during a rare break, I found myself feeling hopeful about the future, a future that I was building on my own terms. As I scrolled through social media, a post from Sophia suddenly caught my eye. My heart skipped a beat as I read it. Asterisk, excited to announce that Michael and I are engaged. Can't wait to start our life together. Asterisk, the photo showed Sophia, smiling, with her arm wrapped around Michael, the same Michael who had abandoned me and our child without a second thought. They looked so happy, as if nothing in the past had ever happened. A wave of emotions washed over me. Anger, hurt, betrayal. But then I looked over at David, peacefully playing in his crib, and a realization dawned on me. I didn't need their approval or their love. Everything I truly needed was right here, with David. The years passed quickly, filled with a whirlwind of diapers, textbooks, and late-night study sessions. My last semester of college was especially tough. I was taking extra classes to graduate on time, still working at the restaurant, and caring for a lively 5-year-old. Graduation day came with a flood of emotions. As I stood in line, waiting to receive my diploma, I scanned the crowd and saw Aunt Harper and Uncle Thomas, beaming with pride. David was perched on Uncle Thomas's shoulders, waving every time he spotted me. Later, at the graduation party Aunt Harper and Uncle Thomas had organized, I was pulled aside by Evelyn, my boss from the restaurant. "Grace," she began with a smile, "I have an offer for you. I'm looking for a new restaurant manager, and I think you'd be perfect for the job." I was stunned. "Me? But I've only been a waitress," I said, almost in disbelief. Evelyn waved her hand dismissively. "You've been so much more than that. I've watched how you handle difficult customers, how you organize the staff, and how you've balanced work, school, and being a mom. That's exactly the dedication and skill I need in a manager." It felt like a dream come true, a stable job with better pay and hours. This opportunity was exactly what David and I needed to build a new, better life. In the years that followed, life seemed to settle into a rhythm of positive change. I poured myself into my new role at the restaurant, learning everything I could about management and business. David started school, blossoming into a smart, curious boy with a love for reading and baseball. It was during one of his Little League games that I met Andrew. He was there with his son, Kevin, who played on the opposing team. As we started chatting, I was drawn to his kind eyes and easy laugh. "Single dad?" I asked, noticing he was alone. He nodded, a touch of sadness in his smile. "Widow, actually. Kevin's mom passed away when he was a baby." My heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry. That must be hard." "It is," he admitted softly, "but we manage." "What about you?" "Single mom." I chuckled. "Is it that obvious?" Our relationship developed slowly. We were both cautious, having been hurt before, and with children to consider, we didn't rush things. But over time, I found myself falling for Andrew. He was kind and patient, and David adored him. About a year after we met, Andrew proposed. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a quiet moment in his backyard with our boys playing nearby. Our wedding was small and intimate, attended by only close friends and family. As I walked down the aisle with David proudly beside me as the ring bearer, I caught Aunt Harper's eye. She was crying, but her smile was radiant. Life with Andrew, David, and Kevin quickly found a steady, comforting rhythm. A couple of years after our wedding, we welcomed another addition to our family. Our daughter, Zoe, was born on a warm spring morning. As I held her in my arms with Andrew, David, and Kevin gathered around, I felt a sense of completeness I'd never known before. I loved all three of my children deeply, David and Zoe, my biological children, and Kevin, my stepson. Blood didn't matter. They were all my kids. One evening, Aunt Harper was over, helping with the kids, when a familiar voice suddenly caught our attention from the TV. We looked over to see my parents, larger than life on the screen, being interviewed on a local news channel. My father stood at a podium, waving to a cheering crowd. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, Adam Johnson announces candidacy for mayor. My heart nearly stopped. It had been years since I'd seen my parents, even if just on a screen. My father looked older, his hair grayer, but his eyes held that same stern, determined look I remembered all too well. As he spoke about family values and moral integrity, Aunt Harper's face twisted with anger. "Hypocrites," she muttered, her voice shaking. I turned to her, shocked. "Aunt Harper?" She took a deep breath, her eyes still glued to the screen. "There's something you need to know, Grace. Something they've kept hidden for years." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. Then she told me a story that shook me to my core. Many years ago, before Sophia and I were born, my parents had their first child, a boy born with severe physical disabilities. He was born without legs. Rather than supporting and caring for him, they left him at the hospital, too afraid of the shame he might bring. A whirlwind of emotions hit me: shock, disbelief, and a deep sadness for the brother I'd never known. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I whispered, my voice unsteady. Aunt Harper's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Grace. I should have. But after what your parents did to you, I didn't want to add to your pain." That night, after the kids were in bed, I made a decision. I needed to find my brother. With Andrew's support, we hired a private investigator. Weeks passed and finally, we received a lead. My brother was alive, and against all odds, he had thrived. He was a successful writer, married, with children of his own. He had been adopted by a loving family that had given him every opportunity to succeed. Meeting him for the first time was surreal. Though he looked different, I could see parts of myself in his face. His name was Robert, and he greeted me with a warm smile and open arms. "I always knew I had a biological family out there somewhere," he said gently. "I just never thought I'd find a sister." In the months that followed, Robert and I grew close. I introduced him to my family, and he welcomed us into his. His wife, Julia, a name that made us laugh at the coincidence, became a friend, and their 2 children were quickly part of our extended family. Years passed, bringing both joy and sorrow. David, my oldest, had just turned 18 and started college on a baseball scholarship. I couldn't have been prouder of the man he was becoming. Then, one quiet Tuesday afternoon, I was scrolling through news articles when a familiar face caught my eye. It was my father, looking older but still carrying that same air of self-importance. The headline read, "Mayor Adam Johnson discusses family values in an exclusive interview." Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked on the video. For a few minutes, I watched as my father spoke about the importance of family and moral values. Then the interviewer asked about his children. My father's face softened into what I knew as his public sympathy look. "I have one daughter, Sophia," he said. "She's the light of our lives. Tragically, we lost 2 of our children. The pain never goes away, but it's made our family stronger." I seethed with quiet rage for days. How dare they? How dare they erase both me and Robert, pretending to be tragic, sympathetic figures? Just as I was stewing in my anger, fate seemed to step in. Robert called me one evening. "Grace, guess what? I'm doing a book signing in our hometown next week. It would mean the world to me if you could come." "I wouldn't miss it for anything," I told him, a plan already forming in my mind. The following week, I found myself back in the city where I'd grown up. As I walked through the familiar streets, memories flooded back, some sweet, but many painful. I brushed them aside, focused on what I needed to do. The book signing was being held in the grand ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel. When I walked in, I realized Robert hadn't been exaggerating. Half the town seemed to be there, including local celebrities, journalists, and prominent community members. And, unmistakably, my parents. Robert took the stage, speaking passionately about his life, his journey, and the book that had brought him here. When it was time for questions, I couldn't resist. I raised my hand, and when Robert called on me, I stood up, my heart pounding. "Robert," I began, my voice clear, "how does it feel to know that your biological family, who abandoned you at birth, is now sitting in this room, watching you succeed beyond their wildest dreams?" A hush fell over the room as people turned to look at my parents, their expressions ranging from shock to curiosity. My father's face turned pale, and my mother looked down, avoiding the stares. Robert didn't miss a beat. He smiled warmly at me and said, "I'm grateful for the family I have now, the one that accepted and loved me without conditions. And I'm grateful to have found my sister." He paused, looking directly at my parents, and added, "Some people in life lose their way, but others find family in the least expected places." The silence was deafening. My father stood abruptly and stormed out, with my mother following close behind, her face flushed with embarrassment. As they left, I felt a deep sense of peace, as if I'd finally closed a painful chapter. Robert, his family, and I spent the rest of the evening celebrating his success. That night, surrounded by the people who had become my true family, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. I was finally free from the weight of my past, free to embrace the life I had built, and free to cherish the family I had found. Business leaders and politicians mingled in the grand ballroom, awaiting the event start. In the front row sat my parents and Sophia. My father, now the mayor, looked every bit the distinguished politician, his suit sharp and his posture commanding. My mother was elegantly dressed, smiling and nodding at familiar faces, while Sophia sat beside them, her gaze fixed ahead. They hadn't noticed me, seated near the back, my heart pounding so loudly it felt as if everyone could hear it. Then, Robert rolled onto the stage in his wheelchair to a wave of applause. He looked poised, comfortable, and powerful in the spotlight. He began speaking about his book and life journey, his voice steady and warm. I watched my parents closely as Robert spoke about being born with a severe disability, no legs, and other health issues. My biological parents abandoned me at the hospital, unable or unwilling to care for me, he said. My father's expression remained practiced and unreadable, as if he were merely listening to someone else's story. It's a sad story, Robert continued, but I was lucky. I was adopted by a wonderful family who gave me every chance to succeed. He paused, then added, still, I always wondered about my birth family, who they were, and why they gave me up. The room was silent, completely absorbed in his story. I felt my pulse race, knowing the moment that would change everything was approaching. Robert then smiled, a spark of humor and determination in his eyes. But that's not the end of my story. You see, I found my family. My sister Grace is here today. He turned, extending a hand towards me. Grace, would you join me on stage? A collective gasp spread through the audience as I stepped into the spotlight. Many faces in the crowd registered recognition. After all, I had grown up in this town. But the most stunned reactions were from the front row. My parents' faces drained of color, and Sophia looked as if she'd seen a ghost. They knew their carefully built image was beginning to crack. My parents stood, clearly planning a hasty exit, but I wasn't going to let them escape the truth yet again. Mom, Dad, please stay, I called out, my voice echoing through the now silent room. I think it's time we had an honest conversation, don't you? They froze, caught under the scrutiny of the entire audience. Reluctantly, they sat back down. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Many of you knew me growing up. You knew my family. But there's a lot you didn't know, a lot that's been hidden for far too long. I paused, gathering my strength. Then I told them everything. I explained how my parents had abandoned Robert at the hospital, ashamed of his disabilities. I described how they hid his existence, building their public image on lies. And then, history repeated itself. I continued, my voice stronger now. When I became pregnant at 17, they didn't offer me support or understanding. They demanded I have an abortion, even after doctors warned that doing so could make me infertile. When I refused, they kicked me out, pregnant alone and abandoned, all to protect their perfect image. Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd as people absorbed the weight of my words. I saw people shooting disgusted looks at my parents, who seemed to shrink further into their seats. For years, I've heard my parents talk about family values and morality, I said, my voice trembling with emotion, but their actions tell a different story. They abandoned 2 of their children when we needed them the most. They erased us from their lives to preserve their perfect image. The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting, some at my parents, others in heated conversations with each other. Journalists, who had come expecting a simple book signing, were frantically taking notes, speaking into their phones, or pointing cameras at the unfolding scene. In the middle of the uproar, I locked eyes with my father. The man who once seemed so powerful and infallible in my childhood now looked small, defeated, and broken. My mother sat beside him, openly crying, her face a mixture of regret and shame. Sophia sat frozen, her face a mask of shock and confusion. In the days that followed, news of the incident spread quickly. Robert's story, my revelations, and my parents' hypocrisy became a scandal that rippled through the community. My father's political career crumbled as people began questioning his integrity. The image they had crafted for so long was finally shattered. Meanwhile, my family, the one I had chosen and created with love, stood by my side. Robert and I grew even closer, grateful for the chance to make up for lost time. Aunt Harper and Uncle Thomas remained my steady support, and Andrew, David, Kevin, and little Zoe were my constant sources of joy. Despite everything, I finally felt free from the weight of my past, free to live openly and truthfully, and surrounded by a family that truly loved and accepted me. In the days that followed, the story exploded. It spread from local news to national headlines. My father, who had built a career on preaching integrity and family values, was exposed as a hypocrite. His political career crumbled almost overnight, and within a week, he resigned, citing personal reasons that fooled no one. The college where he taught distanced themselves quickly, and he was let go. Amidst all the chaos, one thing became painfully clear. My sister Sophia made her choice. She stood firmly by our parents, refusing to acknowledge the truth. During a brief, tense phone call, she hissed, "You've ruined everything. Don't contact me again. You're dead to me, just like you're dead to Mom and Dad." But life has a way of throwing surprises. A few days later, I received a call from a number I hadn't seen in over 20 years. It was Michael, now Sophia's husband and the father of my oldest son. "Grace," he said, his voice hesitant and almost unsure. "I've been thinking about us, about what happened. Sophia and we can't have children. And I thought, well, we have a son together. Maybe we could be a family." I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. "Michael, you made your choice 20 years ago. You left me when I was pregnant with your child. You married my sister. And now, just because you can't have kids with her, you think you can come back to me? No. That's not how it works." "But Grace, please," he tried again. "No, Michael. I have a wonderful husband and a beautiful family. I don't need you, and I certainly don't want you. Goodbye." I hung up, feeling an unexpected sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. But the surprises didn't stop there. The next day, I got another call, this time from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a gentle, tentative voice spoke. "Grace? This is Mia, Michael's mother. We just found out about David. Is it true? Do we have a grandson?" The conversation that followed was emotional and eye-opening. Mia explained that Michael and my parents had told them I'd had an abortion and disappeared. For years, they believed their grandchild never existed. "We'd like to meet him," she said, her voice trembling. "If that's okay with you. Of course, we'd understand if you don't want us in your lives." I thought for a moment. Michael's parents weren't responsible for what Michael had done or for the lies my parents had told. They, too, had been deceived. "Okay," I replied finally. "I'll talk to David and see if he's open to meeting you." The meeting between David and his grandparents went surprisingly well. There were tears, hugs, and a lot of catching up. David, always kind-hearted, welcomed them with open arms, and they embraced him with a joy they'd been denied for so long. In the months that followed, life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. Robert and his family became a regular part of our lives, filling our home with laughter, support, and love. Aunt Harper and Uncle Thomas doted on all their grandchildren, biological or not, always making sure each child knew they were cherished. David's newfound grandparents also became a welcome part of his life, bringing him a sense of family history and connection. As for my parents and Sophia, I only heard bits and pieces. They had moved away, trying to escape the scandal. Part of me felt a trace of sympathy for them, but I knew that telling the truth had been the right choice. For the first time, I felt free from their expectations and the weight of their lies. With my true family surrounding me and the painful past finally behind me, I could finally embrace a future filled with love, honesty, and the family I had built, one that was stronger and truer than any image my parents had tried to create.